We are entering a period where labor is simply scarce, which feels to me inflationary. And at the same time, we have a scarcity beginning in resources. We have a market today which feels superficially like 2000. And I think it's going to play out initially like 2000. And then, unfortunately, it's going to phase, as he suggests, into the 70s, where the deflationary effects on the economy and the stock market will result in a world rather like the 70s, where all assets are simply much lower priced than they are today. Oh, a word on inflation, too. I completely agree with Ray on short-term problems, which I would summarize as monetary and general Federal Reserve overstimulus for 30, 35 years. The war and COVID, all of those three influences guaranteeing that we have relatively intractable problem in the short to intermediate term. What worries me is the longer-term arguments for inflation, which is one, we are running out of people. In China, where the 500 million extra farmers precipitated globalization, they have now had diminishing cohorts of 20-year-olds for 20 years. And they are guaranteed, since they're alive now, we know the baby cohorts are dropping like a stone. They are simply going to have a shortage of labor, as is the developed world together. That is not a trivial block, the developed world plus China. All of them will be squeezed for labor. After the bubonic plague, they had a 100-year honeymoon period in which wages went up so much it wasn't reached for another several hundred years in the Industrial Revolution. And we are entering a period where labor is simply scarce, which feels to me inflationary. And at the same time, we have a scarcity beginning in resources. And we keep an original, unusual index, a GMO. It's 36 equal weighted the most important commodities. So it's not dominated by oil. And it showed a declining pattern for 102 years from 1900 to 2002. And yes, it was interrupted by World War I and World War II and OPEC. Why wouldn't it be? But it wanted to go down. It went down 70%. It took the index down to 30. Today, 122 years later, the index is down 10%. It has gone to 90. The average important commodity has just spent the last 20 years going from 30 to 90. It has tripled. The reason is, of course, the growth of China, but I believe, fairly passionately looking at the data, that it also represents the intrinsic scarcity. The war between deeper wells, worse iron ore, etc. The struggle is always between technology, which for 100 years got ahead of scarcity. It was 2 paces down for deeper and 3.5 paces up for technology. And now we've reached a phase where we've gone through that stuff. And now we have 2 paces up for technology and 3 paces down for scarcity. The data is screaming at us now for 20 years that we're beginning to run out. And a war, of course, and COVID, we're so fragile, all you have to do is cough now, and it ricochets around the world in price spikes and shortages and bottlenecks. And that is the world we better get used to living in. We're going to have a world of increasing number of bottlenecks and shortages. And the same applies to food. The UN Food Index is higher today than any time in its history of the last 50 years. Since it started. You have price pressure on raw materials, metals, food. You have price pressure long-term on labor. This surely feels like a new era in which inflation will be part of the background music, just like it was in the 20th century, and perhaps more so.
Ray also mentioned the dangers of high debt levels, and you've certainly spoken about that in the past. And so could you share some of your thoughts there as well?
The risk of a debt bubble breaking and the risk of an equity bubble breaking have simply not been understood by our Federal Reserve since Paul Volcker. They are incredibly naive. They haven't even got a clue. They're not even interested in the idea. The idea, Bernanke saying, oh, the US housing market's always has never declined. It merely reflects a strong US economy. Alan Greenspan encouraging, etc., right through until today. They don't realize that they're playing with such fire. My second point, high levels of debt are just far too often seriously dangerous and should be, in general, discouraged actively. That should be one of the responsibilities of top management, including the Fed, etc. And let me just give you an example. Why do you like low rates? Because it encourages debt. Why do you like more debt? Because it encourages growth. That's the idea. So let me give you the ultimate statistical test of it. We started in 1985, and we have been modestly increasing the debt to GDP ratio, all debt together, just drifting slightly up due to technology. And then the technology, I mean the introduction of more and more sophisticated financial instruments, but not rising dramatically. And then in 85, it kills to a 45-degree angle and shoots across any page and goes from about 1.1 times GDP to well over 3. So in that little window of 35 years, we triple the debt to GDP ratio. It's a big chunk of time. It's the biggest, most important economy on the planet, a pretty good test. So what happens to growth? It inflects downwards. And from 85, we grow more slowly. Grant you, there are many other factors at work. It's a complicated picture. But there is little room in that equation for the idea that more debt creates more growth. It is not proven in the data. It is held to be the case. It is an assumption like most of modern economics, but it is not proven by the data. I would suggest that there is no evidence at all that increased levels of macro debt to GDP have anything to do with growth. They have everything to do with higher risk from time to time. I think the world has simply been running way over its capacity, and the great luxury of the last 200 years of fossil fuels, coal and then oil and gas, have catapulted us far above our long-term ability to sustain. The good news is it catapulted science and research as well as income and consumption. We're going to have to rely enormously on research and our inventiveness to save our bacon. And I do believe there is a decent chance that it will. Quite a number of years ago, I got into studying the rise and fall of civilization. And I always like to recommend Immoderate Greatness by Ophuls. He's done all the heavy lifting for us. He, in a series of chapters, condensed all the major reasons for civilization's failing in the past. And he's read everything. He knows it like the back of his hand. And it's like the cliff notes, very, very serious, well-written, quotable cliff notes on civilization's failing. And he gives 5 or 6 major reasons, which include overburdening the local environment, your soil and your nature and your water. Complexity, which is very energy intensive. And he concludes 2 things. One, that the current global civilization checks off every single one of them, which is rather creepy. And 2, that humans appear to be hardwired to self-destruct. And my take on that is that, like every other organism, we've spent a few million years fighting for survival, and we have learned to grab what we can when we can. And like other organisms, to grow, we propagate basically as much as we can for our first few million years, and we'll expand to fill the space available. We are not programmed to think about long-term, slow-moving consequences. And so we don't. We have to look at things today like President of Brazil encouraging the greatest deforestation in Brazil's history in the last 12 months, to everybody's shock. But we also have to live in a world where President Trump was doing his best to undo all the good that EPA and environmental movements had been trying to do. It's pretty bizarre to have a couple of serious countries attempting to ignore the greatest threat, perhaps, for hundreds of years. I believe that we do have some escape clauses from Mr. Ophuls' prediction of self-destruction, and that is twofold. One, unexpected by everybody, including Malthus in 1798, we are choosing, despite getting wealthier, we are choosing to have fewer children since 1961. It's a remarkably unexpected outcome. It was not predicted, as far as I'm aware, by anybody, let's say, as recently as 1950. And the degree and the speed with which fertility rates are contracting is not really appreciated by anybody, including the financial community. We are not only way down from replacement rate in every developed country except Israel, but we are, if anything, accelerating. And so in the US, we're at 1.65. That's 2.1 children. We're at 1.65. And so way down, a quarter below what is necessary. And many countries in Europe, Italy, Hungary, are way below that. And of course, in the Far East, you culminate in South Korea, which has incidentally overtaken Japan in individual wealth, individual income, I should say. They have a fertility rate below 1. I mean, it's just inconceivable. And China, Japan, Taiwan are all down there at the 1.5. Quite remarkable. And this is not a sufficient condition to save our bacon, but it is a very necessary condition.